Yokoso wa shitare. Welcome back again. Now, just to inform you, this is actually another story involving the main person from the previous story, Minamoto no Hiromasa. And it also has a lot to do with stringed instruments, because if you didn't get enough of it in the previous video, here's more. So, if you like ancient Japanese folk tales, or you like stories about very accomplished musicians, then please like the video. And if over the course of the video you have any questions about the language, about the culture, about the history, feel free to let me know in the comments. But without any further ado, let's get into the actual story. Once upon a time, imawa mukashi. In the reign of Emperor Murakami, there was a man by the name of Minamoto no Hiromasa. If you want to know more about him, again, please check out the previous story. It will tell you all about him, his lineage, his skills, what he's famous for, etc, etc. But what's important here is that suddenly, during this time, a biwa went missing. A very special biwa, and if you want to know what a biwa is, please check out the previous video, I explain it there, but basically, in short, it's a classical Japanese guitar-like instrument. And this biwa had a name, because if you're wondering, what the heck, did somebody misplace their guitar and this is the grounds for a story? Yes, actually, because this was no ordinary biwa. It had a name. Its name was Genjo, and it wasn't just a biwa that some random schmuck had, no. This was the Emperor's biwa. And not only that, it was so high quality, it was so amazing, that it was actually an imperial treasure. Only the Emperor was allowed to play it, or the Emperor could give permission to others to play it if they so desired, but only at the behest and by the grace of the Emperor. That's how important this biwa was. And again, suddenly, it went missing, which was a big deal. I mean, things like this don't just suddenly poof out into thin air. Again, this was a national treasure. It wasn't like it actually got up and walked away. Well, actually, it might, because as you'll see at the end of the story, that wouldn't be that surprising. But regardless, the whole court was up in arms about this. Everyone was freaking out. Where did this special biwa go? And the Emperor in particular bemoaned his fate. He felt absolutely terrible that of all of the reigns of all of the other emperors, that it was in his reign that he would lose such a valuable piece of cultural property. Like, why did this have to happen in my reign to me? I'm ashamed to all my forebears, and I will be ashamed to all of my descendants. Oh no. But after everybody took a minute to bewail and cry about and be sad about the situation, they started asking questions. Why did this happen? Who could have done it? For what purposes? And their train of thought led them to a conclusion. Clearly, this wasn't the work of some random thief who was looking to steal this biwa so he could then sell it on the black market for a ton of money. Now, it could have been a nobleman of some kind, but it's not like the nobles were hurting for money. It's not like they didn't have their own biwas that were just as good, if not even better than this one. Unless, of course, there is the possibility that there was a nobleman who was not happy with His Majesty and wanted to see him suffer in a very personal way. And so everybody concluded that it must have been the work of somebody who just wanted to see the Emperor hurt, who just wanted to cause some chaos. That had to be it. That was the only explanation that made any sort of sense. Cue the main character, Minamoto no Hiromasa. And again, if you've seen the previous video, you will know that he was exceptionally skilled with the biwa and a big fan of the practice of playing the biwa. So of course, news reached him about this disappearance of the special imperial treasure Genjo, and he also began puzzling over it. What could have happened? What can I do? Could I potentially find it? But ultimately, there was nothing that he could do. Even though he was a Denjobito, which was one of the highest ranking positions of nobility, one of the highest court rankings you could have. But ultimately, even with all of his power and all of his authority, there was nothing he could do about it. He didn't know where it was. And it's not like the culprit was going to waltz right in front of them and just put his hands out in front and say, "Take me, it was me. I have been a very bad person." So everyone just kind of carried on with life like normal. Until one day, Minamoto no Hiromasa was hanging out at the Seikyo-den in the Imperial Palace grounds. Because you had the Imperial capital, Heian is what it was called back in the day. And then you had the Dai-Dairi, which was like the Imperial Palace complex. And then you had the Dairi, which was the actual quarters of the emperor. It was his actual estate. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Seikyoden was in the Dai-Dairi, which means that it was in the palace grounds complex, but it wasn't part of the emperor's official residence. But it was close enough that anybody who was staying there could have quick access to the emperor if need be. It's where all of the aristocrats and all of the government officials kind of hung out. But Minamoto no Hiromasa was hanging out at the Seikyoden kind of later into the afternoon. Everybody had already wrapped up with whatever work they were doing and had gone home, and everything had quieted down, so it was nighttime. And Minamoto no Hiromasa was still up, doing who knows what, when all of a sudden, through the quiet night, he heard the sound of a biwa. And not just a biwa, but it was distinctively Genjo. Somebody was playing Genjo. And at first, Hiromasa thought that, whoa, I must be hearing things. So he took a minute, shook himself, and then he listened again, very, very intently, because it was the faintest playing that he could hear. But sure enough, upon hearing again, it definitely was Genjo. And he marveled at this, like, whoa. Everybody's been looking for this biwa for days. What the heck? Why am I hearing it now? And after getting over his astonishment and his sheer surprise, he realized that it was coming somewhere south of him, and he decided that he needed to go find it. But he also didn't have time to gather the necessary preparations that a man of his station normally would undertake before going on some kind of a journey. So, while wearing some very casual clothes and putting on some very casual shoes and only taking one servant page boy with him, he immediately set out heading due south to locate whoever it was that stole this biwa, and he was going to confront them and get it back. And he kept following the sound and kept heading due south until eventually he came to the gate that led into the Dai-Dairi, which was the Suzaku gate. And he got to the Suzaku gate, and yet, even though he got to this gate, so now he was on the edge of the Dai-Dairi, it was still coming from the south. Now it sounded like it was really close, but he couldn't be sure. So he continued, leaving out of the Dai-Dairi and into the city proper. And he still kept heading south because he could hear it, but no matter how far he went, it always just seemed a little bit further. Just a little more, and a little more. Until eventually, he got so far south in the city that he ended up at the Rashomon, which was the southernmost gate into the city itself. Now, some of you who are big Akira Kurosawa fans may recognize that name, Rashomon, which I believe actually they pronounce it as Rajomon, which I won't get into the details, but it's basically the same thing. But yes, this is the same place where the inspiration behind that story happened as well. The Rashomon gate, which was the southernmost gate in the capital. So Hiromasa arrives at this gate. And as he gets there, he can now tell that it is coming from this gate. But not just inside the gate, like down underneath it. It's coming from the second story. Because if you see in this picture, the gates that they had, you had the actual gate that you would pass through. But then they had an upper level where people who were manning the gate could stand atop and look out and make sure that anybody who was trying to cross through the gate was somebody that they wanted to allow. But you couldn't just access it. You couldn't just climb up there. And so Hiromasa is now standing underneath this gate, looking up and realizing that the playing is coming from that second story. Whoever stole this biwa is up there playing it. And he just stood there for a second going, what the heck is going on? And he didn't say that out loud, but he thought that. But as soon as he stopped under the gate and thought this, the playing stopped. And there was a brief silence for a hot minute. And as soon as it stopped, Hiromasa began thinking that this was not a person. Oh no. Again, it was too strange. The fact that it started playing at night, the fact that it sounded so close, and even after traversing the entire length of the city, it sounded like it was just right there the whole way. And now it's up in this gate? Like, this is not normal. Something about this is off. Whoever or whatever is playing this is not a human, but in fact an oni. And some of you who are familiar with Japanese folklore may be thinking of the oni as like the big, hulking, monstrosity, ogre-like creatures. You know, the Aka Oni, the red demon, or the blue demon, or something like that. However, in this period of Japanese history, oni were not that. Oni were much more like ghosts. They were some kind of spiritual, quasi-spiritual, supernatural phenomenon almost. And the story doesn't explain what they ever look like in a previous story with Abe no Seimei, who sees these Oni, but it never describes what they actually look like. But it is very clear that they are not necessarily physical beings, they are some kind of spiritual, ghost-like entity. So Hiromasa is now kind of freaked out, because again, he's standing at the bottom of this gate. The biwa playing that he was just hearing has now stopped, but he knows it's up there. And he is now convinced that this is no human playing this thing. But after waiting for a moment, almost like the Oni was listening, knew he was there or had heard something, and was waiting to make sure that the coast was clear, it started playing yet again. And Hiromasa had to take a second, because now he knew it was here, and he had to do something about it. But he was also kind of freaked out. So he took a second, he gathered his courage, he mustered up some courage, and he pronounced himself in a dignified and a strong voice. "Who is it that is playing this biwa? For many days Genjo has been missing, and the Emperor has been asking where it has disappeared to, bemoaning its loss. And tonight I heard it from the Seikyoden, and I have followed the sound here, continuously coming south. Thus have I come to uncover this mystery. Show yourself." And of course, as soon as he said this, the playing stopped abruptly. And there was a brief pause, a very tense moment, when it was just silent. And then all of a sudden, Hiromasa saw something fall from the roof. And of course this shocked him, and he instantly leapt back to make some space to see what was going on. And at first he couldn't tell what it was. It was this thing that seemed to just suspend in midair, but it was dark and he couldn't make it out. But upon watching it for a second, it just kind of hung there in the air. It didn't do anything. And then, after he had a better look at it, he noticed that it was Genjo, suspended from a rope that was originating above him. So this Genjo had been tied to a rope and then lowered down to this first story and was just hanging there. And of course, Hiromasa didn't know what exactly to make of this. Like, is this Oni offering it back to me? Is this a trap? What is even going on? But for Hiromasa's part, he decided that he wasn't going to question anything. The biwa was here, Genjo was here, so he instantly grabbed it, untied it from the rope, took it, and he ran. He ran back to the deity, he ran back to the palace as fast as he could. He wasn't going to stick around and ask questions. He got what he came for, and he was out. And the story doesn't mention when exactly he came before the Emperor, whether it was later that night or whether it was the next day. But eventually, Hiromasa did present Genjo to the Emperor, and he explained the whole situation. He told the Emperor the whole story of everything that had happened and how he suspected and was pretty sure that it wasn't a person that stole it, but an Oni. And the Emperor was so relieved. He was so grateful to Hiromasa for recovering his prized imperial treasure that he thanked him profusely. And of course, not only the Emperor, but everybody in the court was just astonished how brave he had been, how successful he had been in not only relocating this, but standing up to a supernatural enemy. Like, whoa, Hiromasa is no joke. So he won the favor of the Emperor and all of his peers. Well, I'm sure some of his peers actually didn't like him for this. His political enemies probably were like, darn that Hiromasa, now he's gonna get in tight with the Emperor. Ugh, this sucks. Because that's politics. And then the final paragraph to this story is that this Genjo, of course, was a very special biwa. But it wasn't just because it was a high quality biwa. No sir, this biwa seemed to have a mind of its own. Almost like it was alive. Or maybe not even almost. It was just like a living thing. If one were to play it in a very unskilled or improper fashion, it would get upset. And then it would stop making noise. You could pluck the strings and nothing would come out of it. Or, for example, if you let it sit there and get dirty and dusty and you didn't clean it, you didn't take proper care of it, and then suddenly decided, you know what, I want to play Genjo again, and you came to it and tried plucking the strings, nothing. It would just shut up until you cleaned it off, and until you showed it the proper respect, it would stay silent. And then there was even one instance where the Imperial Palace caught on fire. And before you guys start freaking out and be like, oh my gosh, the Imperial Palace caught on fire, the thing about ancient Japanese architecture is it was almost exclusively built with wood, because building things out of stone was really kind of impractical in a country where earthquakes happened all the time and people hadn't developed the technologies to really account for that. So instead, they built everything out of wood. Problem with wood, in pre-modern society where the only thing that you have to light your way at night is fire, is that, well, things catch on fire. And so pretty much every major historical building in Japan has burned down at least once, if not multiple times, which includes the Imperial Palace. But at one time, the Imperial Palace actually caught on fire. And in the hubbub of everybody trying to escape and getting some things that they could out safely and not dying, everybody was worried that they had actually lost Genjo because nobody had picked it up and brought it out. Until they went back onto the grounds and found it, nobody having touched it, laying there, just hanging out in the garden. Again, nobody had touched it. Clearly, it had moved of its own accord. And that is why Genjo was an imperial treasure. And thus is it said that the actions of Minamoto no Hiromasa and this imperial treasure biwa Genjo were indeed astonishing. Okay, so that's it for this story. Thank you for listening. And if you like the story, please like the video. If you want to know more about it, please let me know in the comments any questions that you might have. And if you want to stay informed when other stories come, because there are plenty where that came from, please subscribe to the channel. Oh, I do want to say, this is going to be the final story of this section of stories. Technically, there are a lot more, but they all have to do with the story behind the creation of a poem. And as much as I love Japanese poetry, some of them, most of them, are actually a little bit boring unless you are very familiar with the language of classical Japanese. So we're going to skip this. But what that also means is that the next stories that we're going to be dealing with involve warriors. Another term that you might know them by is samurai. So we're going to be looking at the very early samurai, even though they weren't called samurai back in the day. They were called bushi. They were called warriors. But we're going to be jumping into probably what is one of the most well-known topics of ancient Japan, the warriors. So get excited for that because we've got some stories, okay? We've got some stories, so please subscribe to the channel if you want to know more. And I am going to thank you one final time. Ito katejike no koso haberi kere. And hopefully we will see you next week for warrior time. Goodbye.